Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Faculty in Focus, where we blur the lines between the work done by Ohio State Lima faculty and the greater Allen County community. I'm your host, Maggie Young, and throughout Faculty in Focus, we will explore Ohio State Lima faculty interests and how they relate to the greater Allen County region. Today, I'm excited to have with me Dr. Robin Bagley. She's an assistant professor of evolution, ecology, and organismal biology. Her research focuses on pine sawflies, which are small insects that live in pine trees. And when you hear her talk about them, you will most definitely fall in love with them, or at least with the wonders of science. So Robin, thank you so much for joining me today. I think the question that I want to ask first is, why bugs? How did you get interested in studying insects and sawflies in particular?
It's a great question, and I always wish that I had a really philosophical answer, which I never do. I was actually terrified of bugs when I was a little girl, so my mom always laughs when she realizes that I am a grown adult who has a research lab that focuses on insects. But I found my way to them in a happenstance. So I initially started my college career not really knowing what I wanted to do other than knowing I liked biology. So my only science mentor who looked like me was Miss Frizzle. So I actually started out wanting to be a high school biology teacher, but I stumbled my way into research projects. First one being cancer biology, great, but not for me. Second one being when I met my one true love of sawflies. And it was kind of like the heavens just opened up when I was hearing about them from my research advisor. There was something about them that was just so fascinating. And in that moment, I was like, this is what I want to do for the rest of my life. So it's maybe not like I didn't always chase bugs when I was little, but when I found them, they were just so fascinating and I really wanted to learn more about them.
Well, I think, I mean, you clearly had an interest in science. So then it's how do we apply that love or that interest in a way that is meaningful for you? And clearly, sawflies are that. So can you talk a little bit about what makes sawflies so unique? Why is it maybe worthwhile to know more about them?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the thing that initially drew me to them was that nobody knows what a sawfly is. And I've always been a fan of the underdog. So, sawflies, you've almost certainly seen a sawfly. Most people have seen sawflies, but you probably thought it was a caterpillar, just like a kind of weird looking caterpillar that was maybe on a type of tree or a type of plant that you don't expect a caterpillar to be on. So, number one, just knowing that there was a whole group of insects out there that nobody, I could walk up to someone on the street and be like, what is this? And they're all going to say it's caterpillar. That was like, why don't you know about these? Why don't I know about them? And then as I learned more about their sort of unique biology, I was like, hey, these guys are really cool. Like they live in these little groups on pine trees. The trees will literally look half eaten and I'll knock on people's door and be like, hey, can I take these bugs on your tree? And they'll have had no idea they were there. And I'm like, it's a huge red flag to me. Your tree is half eaten by these bugs. Like, how did you not know they were here? And the response is generally just cut down the whole tree and take it with you because they don't even want to know about them because bugs.
I mean, fair. Yeah, totally
Yeah.
fair.
But as for their unique quirks, so they look a lot like caterpillars. They have more of the little fleshy legs on their bellies than normal caterpillars do. So a quick trick, if anybody ever finds something like a caterpillar, count those little fleshy legs. If there's at least 6, it's a sawfly. If there's less than 6, it's a caterpillar. But they have the specific ones I work on, the pine sawflies, they have this really interesting sort of group defense where they eat in these little, groups of about 75 individuals, sometimes goes a little bigger or smaller. And if you wave your hand over them, they all jolt back in time. So now imagine you're a bird and you're like, oh, those look tasty, and you fly down, but all of a sudden 75 larvae are like, you're going to fly away too. You're probably going to be like, I'll eat something else.
Yeah.
Um, and then on top of that, they actually will take the pine sap from the needles that they're eating. So these sawflies eat the needles of pine trees, which is why the trees look half eaten. And they have these little bristly mouth parts that separate out the sap from, the dry part of the plant. And then they keep that sap in these little sacs on the sides of their digestive tract. So when let's say you're an ant and you come up to a sawfly and you bite it on the butt or something, it's going to rear back and vomit up a little droplet of pine sap and then flail to try to put it on the ant. Now for us, that's not a big deal, right? You just get a sticky hand. for an ant, a drop of pine sap going on a little thing like an ant, you're not having a good day anymore, and you're probably going to stop trying to eat that sawfly.
Yeah.
So it's just, although they're so tiny, they have all of these really interesting behaviors. They're beautiful colors. The study I work with the most has a vivid red head and a bright yellow, like highlighter yellow body. There's just so fascinating that this thing that's so little that nobody knew about is so complicated.
Well, I think that that's one of the things that I always find so fascinating, maybe about research or biology research in general, is that the small things have such sophisticated mechanisms of keeping themselves safe or keeping their group safe. I mean, the fact that they work together, they collaborate to keep their family, for lack of a better word, safe. I mean, it's fascinating stuff. Have you found any in Lima or nearby?
So I haven't found it in Lima yet, although when I got here last year, it was a little late for them for this time of year. I do have field sites where I have found specifically the species that I work with in other areas of Ohio, as well as right over the border in Bagley, Michigan. So I would be shocked if they're not here. There are some records of some invasive species of sawflies in this area as well, that are mostly found on white pine, but can do some pretty heavy damage themselves.
All right. Well, I have a couple pine trees that are looking a little worse for wear, so I think I'm gonna have to invite you over
Yes,
to look for some of the reasons perhaps that my trees are not doing very well. But it could just be my landscaping skills. So you talked a little bit about where you can find them. Can you tell me about the sawfly environment? So you said that they live in pine trees. What other kind of organisms might live near them or impact their development?
Sure. So they actually have a really interesting and close relationship with their pine tree hosts, first off. So my broad answer for where you can find sawflies is if there are pine trees, you'll find pine sawflies of some species. And they actually do this really cool thing. Their name sawfly, people ask me a lot, where did that name come from? And it comes from the fact that the organ that the female uses to lay her eggs, which we call an ovipositor, it's actually shaped like a tiny saw. So if you were to 3D print a zoomed in version of a sawfly egg laying thing, you could cut a tree down with it. But they use that little tiny saw to cut pockets inside of pine needles. So I think everybody's touched a pine needle sometime in their life. So what she has to do is very carefully cut a pocket that's big enough for her egg, but isn't so big that it cuts all of the resin flow through the needle. Because if she does that, her egg is going to dry out and die. But if she doesn't cut it deep enough, then that sap, it's still toxic. Pine sap is nasty. I think we've all touched it at least once and we know, and
Yeah.
then her egg will drown. So it's this really tight balancing act between having, the right size and right angle that she cuts that pocket to not let them drown, but also not let them dry out. They also have a bunch of parasites and predators. So the one of the funniest things that I read when I was starting working on sawflies was that a big chunk of their mortality is actually from squirrels digging up their cocoons and eating them for that squishy sawfly center inside. It's kind of like a nougat candy, but the insect version. But I'm personally really interested in the parasites and pathogens that attack them. So one of the things that my lab here at OSU Lima is hoping to do is to take advantage of several boxes of hundreds of parasites that I reared as a result of wanting sawflies during my PhD work. Sometimes you get a sawfly from your cocoon, but sometimes you get a wasp or sometimes you get a fly and you're like, you're not what I was looking for. And I always wondered what these were. So that's what my lab will be doing. We'll be looking at who these things that aren't sawflies are that occasionally come out of sawfly cocoons so we can understand more about that big community that they live in.
Oh, that's awesome. So then what would the study of parasitoids tell us about the development of certain species or their environments? Kind of zooming back a little bit so we can see a little bit more about the effect.
Sure. So that's a great question. So, although we often study an organism as biologists, doing that kind of ignores the fact that these things have a lot of pressures on them when they live. So understanding who the parasites are will tell us if there are different sets of parasites across the country. So the sawflies I work on live all across Eastern North America. So it's reasonable to think that the sawflies that live in Ohio or Michigan may have a completely different set of pathogens, predators, et cetera, than a sawfly living in Florida, even if they're the same species. So first off, just knowing if there are different sets of parasites tells us a little bit about the sort of day-to-day experience that the sawflies themselves have, and that can help us to explain patterns that we see in sawfly biology. So for instance, we know that the sawflies up here have a little bit of a different genome than the ones in Florida do. They are isolated from each other. They don't seem to have opportunities to exchange genes, which maybe isn't shocking since, sawflies can't get on a plane and fly down to Florida like we can. But it helps us to understand sort of those different selection pressures that different sawflies may have. It also just helps us to understand the way that organisms in general respond to their environments. So I mentioned that the sawflies have there's basically different populations depending on where you are in the country. Those parasites may have that too. So if we do find the same species of parasites in Michigan and Florida, they could be doing what the sawflies are doing, and just we have, a pretty distinct population of those parasites here, different distinct one in Florida, and that'll help us predict, what happens if new sawfly populations form. Can we expect that they'll take parasites with them and that they'll be able to attack and help control them? Or will we need to look into other measures to control potential outbreaks when these things inevitably get introduced across the country?
Wow, that's fascinating. Um, I think one of the most astounding things about studying maybe a small insect like the sawfly or their parasitoids is how many different species of insects there are. And I think that's something that you're interested in, right?
Yes,
So
yes.
how do you go about trying to find out how many different species of insects there are?
That's a good question. I have a question for you before I start this.
All
How many
right.
species of insects do you think there currently are that we know about?
Oh, I couldn't even begin to guess. I think we're getting into those some kind of not millions, not billions, not trillions, but beyond that.
Maybe not quite that big.
Well, I will say my sons like to talk about the number of infinities that they are. So, I mean, when I think about how many bugs currently reside in my house, which may tell you a little bit about my living environment, but you think about it, that's just in my house, and I'm just one house in one small town in one state in one country. I mean, there's a
Yeah.
lot.
So our current number of described species of insects, so that's ones that we've gone through the whole process that's required to describe a species, is about 1 million, which is a lot. To compare that, when I say animal, a lot of people will think of something like a bird or a dog or a cat. Birds have about 10,000 species, and mammals only have about 5,500 species. So just to give you a scale of how much more diverse insects that we know about are
Right.
10,000 versus 1 million.
That's a big difference. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And our estimates for insects is that there's probably about 6 million different species of insect if we were able to go out and actually describe all of them. That is one way we could really understand the diversity of insects, right? We could go out and we could describe them. But the problem there is that a lot of insects are hard to find, although it's really easy to find things like mosquitoes. I can just sort of like hop outside my house at any point during mosquito season and we'll be swarmed. A lot of them, live in very specific environments, some of which are being threatened by human activities. And even if we can find them, a lot of insects, especially a lot of the parasites that my lab will be working on, are really tiny. Like they're only a couple of millimeters long. So to even be able to look at them to see if they're different, you have to have specialized equipment. And then to go on to the next steps of really understanding, are you actually a different species? You need to be able to sequence their DNA. You need to be able to do behavioral experiments. You need to be able to understand, who are they attacking? What are they even doing? And those are real challenges that, fewer and fewer biologists are being trained to address because sort of the funding climate wants these really applied questions. We're still working on it, especially when we can link it to these really, sort of what are the drivers of global diversity kinds of questions. So if we can understand why there's so many insects, that helps us describe a big chunk of the diversity on Earth. The real strategy that we take for getting a better idea of what these numbers are is usually by doing targeted studies where we can look at groups of insects where we're pretty confident we understand them. So things like mysophilies that are pests where people have gone and done that natural history work because we don't want them to eat our Christmas trees or we don't want them to eat our apple orchards or stuff like that. And in those, we can look and we can say, okay, this insect has this many parasites. It has this many bacteria that are associated with it. It has this many nematodes. It has this many mites. And then we can create ratios that we can sort of extrapolate out to get a better estimate there while we're waiting for the actual species descriptions to catch up with our estimates.
That's awesome. I mean, you're using math in order to kind of figure out, and logic in order to figure out how diverse our world is. And so, I mean, you had talked a little bit about this, that, looking at global diversity, what does that tell us about our world and how we interact with it?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think that, first off, we're just curious. We want to categorize our world, like there's no sort of, reason other than our basic curiosity for why we name species. But it lets us predict what's happening. So we live in a changing world. This is something that we can see evidence of. I mean, even if you just look the last couple of years, there's really sort of what we would consider extreme weather patterns, different flooding, and all of this. Those changes are things that we have to weather, but they're also things that the rest of the organisms on this planet weather with us. So when we look at describing species and we look at what some like common drivers and common things that say, oh, this place has a lot of species that are described, or this, group of organisms seems to be really diverse. If we can understand those, we can predict what might happen moving forward. So, we are working, and globally people are working to control climate changes and to minimize other things like deforestation and all of these things that are causing issues and impacting the rest of living beings. But when we understand what's going on even without our influence, we can mitigate or help predict what might happen as climates continue to change.
Well, I think that's so interesting, that looking at such a tiny little insect like the sawfly with its, cute little red hat. I think that the fact that you can learn so much about that and how it affects those larger systems that we all interact with, that we as humans and the animals that we cohabitate with, and even the bugs, yes, even the bugs, that we can learn so much and we can gain so much wisdom from studying just that cute little guy. Well, Robin, I am so glad that you were able to join us for this episode of Faculty in Focus. I want to congratulate you on joining the select group of OSU Lima faculty invited to our little mug club as part of our focus on faculty scholarship, both inside and outside of the classroom. Be sure to check out our other episodes of Faculty in Focus on the Ohio State Lima YouTube channel. And from all of us here at OSU Lima, thank you for tuning in to another episode of Faculty in Focus. Until next time.